The audience had barely settled into their seats when the atmosphere inside the studio began to shift. Stephen had built a reputation for pushing boundaries, but tonight, it wasn't just witty digs or playful sarcasm. It was something else entirely. The guest sitting across from him, rigid and prepared to dominate the room with presence alone, was none other than Donald Trump. From the very start, there was a tension so thick that even the studio lights seemed to dim beneath it. What was supposed to be a carefully coordinated interview for the sake of ratings and relevance quickly began unraveling the moment Stephen challenged Trump's recent claims about his charitable efforts toward veterans. What should have been a simple exchange of viewpoints turned bitter when Stephen, not missing a beat, brought up discrepancies in Trump's public statements. A quiet murmur rolled through the audience. The timing was perfect, the facts undeniable, and the insinuation razor-sharp. Trump, visibly caught off guard, didn't mask his irritation. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffened, and the audience watched as the back-and-forth transformed from uncomfortable to combustible. Stephen leaned in, refusing to back down. He wasn't making jokes now. He was pulling receipts, reciting reports, and questioning the authenticity behind Trump's self-styled image as a champion for everyday Americans. The tension quickly turned into open hostility. Trump, never one to take public criticism lightly, began listing off his accomplishments in a defensive flurry. But Stephen wasn't buying it, and neither was the audience. Their reactions shifted from laughter to stunned silence as the conversation tilted further into chaos. Trump's temper flared as he accused Stephen of being dishonest, manipulating facts, and being nothing more than a smug television clown paid to attack people he couldn't understand. Stephen responded not with humor, but with the cold detachment of someone who had done his homework. He pressed harder, bringing up Trump's financial dealings, his lawsuits, and the conflicting testimonies from former associates. At this point, the room had lost all sense of levity. This wasn't a talk show anymore. It was a battlefield. The audience felt it in their chests, the kind of heavy silence that falls before a storm erupts. Stephen, for all his showmanship, looked deadly serious. And Trump? He was seething. His tone turned darker, his words sharper, his accusations more personal. And then it happened. Trump leaned forward, pointed at Stephen in a way that was both threatening and desperate, and spat out a tirade that shocked even his most loyal supporters. He raged about media bias, about betrayal, about being constantly hunted by a system that refused to let him speak freely. His voice was strained, almost cracked, like a man cornered and lashing out with everything he had left. Stephen didn't flinch. In fact, he looked as though he had expected this explosion all along. There was no humor left in his face, only a calmness that stung even more than words. It was the look of someone who had waited years for this moment. And now that it was here, he wasn't going to waste it with cheap shots or clever retorts. Instead, he shifted the focus again. This time to Trump's influence over the country's political discourse and the long-lasting damage it had done. He framed it not as a personal failure, but a national one. The weight of that accusation hit hard, especially because it came not from a rival politician, but from a cultural voice that millions tuned into every night. Trump stood up. The entire studio froze. He didn't ask to cut to commercial. He didn't care about optics. He simply rose, adjusted his jacket, and locked eyes with Stephen as though daring him to keep going. And Stephen did. Without blinking, without hesitating, he continued his monologue with a blistering critique that echoed off the walls of the studio like a final judgment. The stage was now set. The confrontation had only just begun, and there was no turning back. Two egos, two worlds, and a nation's eyes, all centered on a moment that would define far more than a single night of television. Trump didn't leave the stage immediately. He stood there frozen at the edge of the carpeted platform, the studio lights glaring down on him like spotlights in an interrogation room. His face was flushed, lips tight, and the muscles in his jaw clenched with the kind of restraint that usually precedes something volcanic. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone whose job was supposed to involve monologues and punchlines, not full-scale confrontations. The audience remained hushed, suspended in the bizarre tension of watching a man torn between storming off and striking back. Ultimately, he chose the latter. Trump turned, faced the camera directly, and began what felt less like a defense and more like a declaration of war. He ranted about the failures of mainstream comedy, about the hypocrisy of late-night television, and how networks used people like Stephen to wage personal vendettas disguised as satire. It was bitter, ugly, and far too personal for the show's intended format. Stephen watched silently at first, arms crossed, as Trump's speech devolved into a barrage of insults against not just him, but the entire cultural machine that had once welcomed Trump as a spectacle. The former president was unraveling, and the audience could sense it. This wasn't bravado. This was someone losing control in real time. Stephen slowly stepped forward, not to interrupt, but to reclaim the stage. When Trump finally paused for breath, Stephen took that opening and filled the space not with laughter, but with brutal clarity. He called out the theatrics, the victimhood narrative, and the constant weaponization of grievance. He reminded the audience that the real power of public discourse lay not in dominance, but in accountability. The words landed like punches. Trump flinched, not physically, but in the subtle ways that only the camera could catch. A flicker in the eye, a twitch of the brow, a quick glance at the exit. For the first time, the bravado cracked. The man who once commanded stages with forceful rhetoric now seemed unsure of how to reclaim the upper hand. Stephen then pivoted, focusing not on the man before him, but the millions watching. He began recounting stories from ordinary Americans, affected by Trump's policies, stories that didn't make headlines but carved deep wounds into people's lives. It was emotional, direct, and free of the usual studio gloss. And Trump stood there, absorbing every word like a blow to his legacy. But he wasn't done fighting. His pride wouldn't let him. Trump responded with venom, dragging Stephen's personal life into the conversation, mocking his past failures, and implying that he was just another mouthpiece for elites hiding behind studio walls. It was a low tactic, meant to provoke, and for a split second, it worked. Stephen's expression faltered just barely, but enough for Trump to sense it, and that was all the opening he needed. Trump doubled down, launching into a tirade about loyalty, betrayal, and how people like Stephen fed off division while pretending to care about unity. He painted himself as the misunderstood reformer, a man hated not for what he had done wrong, but for what he had dared to challenge. Stephen didn't shout. He didn't retaliate with volume. Instead, he dismantled Trump's narrative piece by piece, calmly and with surgical precision. He cited quotes, pulled up video clips, and even introduced a surprise statement from someone who had worked closely with Trump, someone now disillusioned, someone whose testimony aligned perfectly with the argument being made. The audience reacted with a collective gasp. Trump turned pale. There was no way to prepare for that kind of ambush, not when every camera was rolling and the nation was tuned in. His lips moved, searching for a comeback, but none came. And in that silence, Stephen kept going, exposing contradictions, highlighting decisions made behind closed doors, and tying it all back to the original point. This wasn't about Stephen versus Trump. It was about truth versus spectacle. And the spectacle was losing. By the end of the second exchange, Trump looked drained. His shoulders, once squared and proud, had slouched. The man who walked into the studio ready to dominate now stood on the defensive, reacting instead of commanding, absorbing instead of dictating. His followers might later twist the footage, but in the rawness of the moment, one thing was clear. He had been publicly outmaneuvered. Stephen returned to his desk, not to gloat, but to let the moment sit. The cameras cut to a wide shot. The audience still hadn't recovered. The stage felt like a courtroom, and the verdict was beginning to write itself. And as the show rolled into its next segment, the producers faced a dilemma. The energy had shifted so dramatically, they weren't sure whether to proceed with the original plan or prepare for what might come next. Because Trump wasn't finished. He couldn't be. As Trump stood motionless at center stage, cameras rolling and the audience caught in the lingering shock of the confrontation, a quiet storm began to brew beneath his surface. He wasn't used to this kind of silence. Not from a crowd, and certainly not from himself. His instinct was to regain control, reframe the moment, shift the narrative, overwhelm the room with a new headline. But Stephen had shifted the ground under his feet, and Trump could feel himself sinking into it. The producers, watching nervously from the sidelines, debated cutting to commercial. But the spectacle unfolding before them was too potent, too raw. Viewership was likely spiking by the second, and their fingers hesitated on the switch. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. This was a cultural moment unraveling in real time. Stephen, now seated, didn't backtrack or soften his stance. He let the weight of the conversation settle, his voice dropping in tone as he spoke directly to the heart of the matter. He questioned, not just Trump's record, but the larger machine that allowed spectacle to substitute for substance. It wasn't a takedown anymore. It was a reckoning. He addressed how manipulation, fear, and showmanship had slowly eroded the public's ability to discern truth from fiction. Trump's expression turned from anger to something else, something closer to unease. But as always, retreat wasn't an option. With one breath, he launched into a retaliatory campaign against Stephen's moral high ground. He accused him of exploiting division for personal gain, of painting himself as a hero when he was just as complicit in the chaos of the times. Trump's voice cracked slightly, a detail the microphones caught and amplified. But he powered through, launching personal insults meant to discredit and destabilize. Stephen let him finish, not out of politeness, but out of precision. When Trump paused, waiting for a reaction, Stephen calmly brought up a list of broken promises and contradicting public statements that directly countered what Trump had just proclaimed. The studio audience didn't need a cue to react. Their silence said it all. The tension now hovered like static, but it was the emotional turn that followed which shifted the tone yet again. Stephen pulled out a letter. A real one, written by a military widow who had lost her husband during a deployment that Trump had publicly taken credit for supporting. The letter detailed her experience, her grief, and her growing disillusionment with political leaders who turned tragedy into talking points. He didn't read the letter aloud. He just held it in his hand, spoke about it, and let the idea of it fill the room. Trump froze. There was nothing performative about this. No charts, no sound bites. Just grief, pain, and the reality of lives affected by decisions made at podiums and behind closed doors. For a moment it looked like Trump might walk off. He glanced at the wings, made a subtle movement toward them, but then turned back. Leaving would mean surrendering the narrative, and he couldn't accept that. So he pivoted again, claiming the media was weaponizing emotion, that entertainers were disguising activism as compassion. He made wild declarations about being misunderstood, scapegoated, targeted for speaking hard truths, but the words landed flat. Not because the audience disagreed, but because they had heard it all before. The performance was old, and the man delivering it no longer seemed larger than life. He seemed tired, frustrated, unraveled. Stephen leaned forward, hands clasped, and asked a single-pointed question that cut through everything. It wasn't aggressive or theatrical, but it carried the weight of everything said so far. Trump faltered. For the first time that night, he didn't respond right away. He looked to the floor, then to the crowd, and finally back to Stephen, eyes glassy but hardened with pride. When he did speak, it wasn't to answer the question, but to issue a defiant declaration that the entire media apparatus would be held accountable for nights like this. He warned that history would vindicate him, that he would be remembered not for moments like these, but for his victories, his defiance, his refusal to be silenced. It was dramatic, impassioned, even moving in a strange way, but it was also hollow. The speech felt more like a final stand than a victory lap. The studio's atmosphere shifted yet again. The audience no longer looked at Trump with fear or curiosity. They looked at him with recognition. They had seen the act. They understood the pattern. And now, watching it unravel, they felt something closer to pity than outrage. Stephen didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence after Trump's speech was enough. It echoed louder than any applause or rebuttal. Then Trump turned to leave. No handshake, no eye contact. Just a heavy walk toward the edge of the stage, shoulders squared but weighed down by something that even he couldn't deflect anymore. As he disappeared behind the curtain, Stephen looked to the camera, face still, composed, and offered the audience something rare. No jokes, no commentary. Just a look that said, sometimes letting the truth breathe is louder than anything else. But one final twist was still coming. Because as the producers prepped to end the segment, someone stepped onto the stage uninvited. Someone Trump had not expected to see again. The figure who stepped onto the stage wasn't a politician, nor a member of the media. She was an unannounced guest from Trump's own past, a woman once involved in his campaign, now estranged, who had since spoken out about internal chaos and broken promises from her time in the inner circle. Her presence turned the already volatile night into something surreal. For a moment even Stephen looked unsure of what to expect. The woman didn't speak at first. She simply took a seat in the guest chair across from Stephen, her eyes locked. On the curtain Trump had vanished behind only moments earlier. Her appearance had been coordinated by the producers, but no one had anticipated the way the night would unfold. They'd expected a tense interview. What they got was a reckoning. Stephen welcomed her in a subdued tone, giving her the space to speak without framing her narrative. And when she did speak, it was with a calm, devastating clarity that cut through the noise of everything that had happened. She spoke of promises made behind closed doors, of loyalty used as currency, and of a culture built on fear rather than conviction. Her story wasn't one of revenge, it was one of awakening. She described how the idealism that once pulled her into Trump's orbit eventually shattered under the weight of manipulation and ego. The studio was dead silent. Trump, watching from backstage, could be seen pacing furiously in the wings. His hands moved with erratic gestures, his voice occasionally raised in a muffled growl picked up by a stray mic. It was clear he hadn't expected this. The show had spiraled far beyond his control, and now his former ally was publicly unspooling the narrative he had tried so hard to keep intact. Stephen remained mostly quiet, giving her the platform. This wasn't about scoring points anymore. It was about peeling back layers. Her words painted a damning portrait, not just of Trump the public figure, but of the atmosphere he fostered, the personal toll it took, and the regret that lingered, long after the cameras stopped rolling. By the time she finished, some members of the audience were visibly moved. There were no applause signs, no forced laughter, just the weight of raw, human honesty pressing into every corner of the room. Backstage, Trump finally snapped. Shouting echoed faintly from behind the curtain, and within seconds he re-emerged onto the stage. But this wasn't the confident, combative version of Trump that had first sat down across from Stephen. This version looked strained, desperate to reclaim some semblance of control. He pointed at the woman, his voice cracking under pressure, accusing her of betrayal, of being used by enemies, of trying to stay relevant by tearing others down. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Stephen stood from his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. But the confrontation had reached its peak, and now it was time to close it. He reminded Trump that the show wasn't about vendettas, but about accountability. That the platform wasn't granted. It was earned. And when that platform was used to divide, manipulate, or exploit, it was only right that it be questioned with full force. Trump stood frozen for a beat, his face a tight mask of fury and disbelief. Then, something remarkable happened. The audience, without a single cue, rose to their feet, not to cheer, but to stand in unified silence. It wasn't about sides. It was about witnessing the moment when power, stripped of its spectacle, stood exposed before a nation hungry for something real. Trump looked at them, eyes darting from face to face, trying to find some recognition of support. But what he saw was honesty, disappointment, fatigue. Not a mob, but a mirror. He turned and walked off again, this time with finality. No exit line, no final flourish. And as the doors shut behind him, Stephen turned back to the camera and finally let a breath escape. He looked to the audience, then back to the woman seated beside him and spoke with quiet resolve. The night hadn't gone according to any script. It had exploded, unraveled, transformed. But out of that fire, something rare had emerged. A moment not for spectacle, but for reckoning. And in that space, truth had finally been heard. As the credits rolled, viewers across the country remained glued to their screens. Some were angry, some vindicated, some simply stunned. But all of them had witnessed something unforgettable. The conversation that began as yet another televised clash had become something else entirely. A confrontation where egos crumbled, truth cut deeper than insults, and for once, the stage belonged not to the loudest voice, but to the one willing to speak with sincerity. Stephen walked off the stage slowly, leaving behind an empty chair and a quiet studio. But across the country the echoes of the night were only just beginning to spread.